The afternoon sun slipped across Eagle Ridge Valley with a softness that felt borrowed from memory rather than the present moment. Light rolled down the ridges in streams of honey gold, filling every crease of the land while shadows gathered in the hollows like cool water. James Thornon rocked gently in the old porch chair, the wood creaking beneath the weight of 75 years that had carved themselves deep into his bones. His walking stick leaned against the railing beside him, its handle worn smooth by decades of calloused fingers. Once those same hands had been swift with a rifle, sure when handling a rope, steady when dressing wounds after long cattle drives. Now they showed every winter he had lived through, knuckles swollen, veins raised under thin skin, strength replaced by the quiet dignity of age. Henry stood nearby, tall for 15, restless in the way boys are when they're full of questions and unsure of how to release them. He'd spent the entire afternoon pretending to study the valley, all the while gathering the courage to ask what had knotted his heart for weeks. When Henry finally spoke, his words spilled out, hurried and awkward, as though they might vanish if he didn't force them free. "Grandpa, folks in town, they say my grandmother was Apache. Some say it like it's wrong. Is it true?" James didn't answer at once. Instead, he stared past his grandson toward the small cemetery beyond the barn, where a fresh bouquet of wildflowers rested over a grave 3 years old. He had set those flowers there just that morning, same as he did every day, part habit and part devotion. Her name, Aayita, still carried a weight in his chest that time couldn't soften. "Yes, boy," James finally said, his voice rough as weathered saddle leather. "It's true." Henry's face twisted with confusion, curiosity, and a flicker of borrowed shame that didn't belong to him. He tried to phrase his next question carefully, unsure of where accusation might start. James lifted one hand, stopping him gently. "Sit down, Henry. You'll hear the real story, not the nonsense folks whisper when they think deafness comes with old age." The boy dropped onto the porch step, his knees drawn close, his eyes alight with a mix of apprehension and anticipation. James let silence hover a moment. Silence had always mattered. It shaped words, gave them weight, made the truth feel earned rather than handed out. When he spoke again, his gaze drifted toward the valley as if the memories lived out there among the cottonwoods and ridgelines. "Everything I have today, this ranch, this family, even my own breath, began with 5 words spoken by a woman holding a knife." The old man let that hang in the air, a beginning sharp enough to cut open the past. "Summer of 78, he continued softly. "I was 38 then. Younger than your father is now, but old enough to have lost more than a man should. And I was dying, Henry, not from bullets or sickness, but from a hollowness inside that no medicine could mend. Your great-grandmother Margaret had been gone 3 years. Fever took her and the baby girl she carried. After that, Ironwood Ranch turned into nothing but chores, dust, and loneliness." He tapped the porch boards lightly with his stick, marking the moment when his life had shifted course. Then one July afternoon, everything changed. It began with gunfire echoing through a dry creek bed and ended with a stranger's courage teaching me what strength truly meant. Not the strength of a man who never breaks, but the strength of one who rises again after being broken. His eyes drifted half-closed as he slipped fully into the memory. That day was blistering, heat so heavy it pressed on your lungs. I was riding the eastern edge of Ironwood, letting Flint, best gelding I ever owned, pick the pace. The land was quiet except for cicadas whining from the cottonwoods. Then Flint stiffened under me, ears pricked forward. That horse's instincts were keener than mine, and when he sensed trouble, I listened. A faint cry drifted up from the dry channel of Black Creek, a sharp, desperate sound that didn't belong to any animal. James steered Flint toward the ravine. Down below, among the scattered shade of cottonwoods, he saw 3 mounted men circling something, or someone. 2 figures crouched against a tumble of rocks, a woman and a child. "Didn't think," James murmured to Henry. "Thinking was for men who believed their lives still held purpose." I raised my Winchester and sent a warning shot cracking off a stone 10 feet ahead of them. The riders jerked in surprise, wheeling their horses around. James made himself into a clear silhouette against the sky, rifle steady, daring them to test their luck. They didn't. Whatever their business, it wasn't worth dying for. They retreated, dust rising behind them. James waited, long enough to ensure it wasn't a ruse, before guiding Flint down into the ravine. The woman stepped forward with a grace sharpened by survival, a knife glinting in her hand. Her clothes were Apache made, her eyes fierce and evaluating. The boy behind her stood silent, clinging to a leather pouch like it held the last pieces of his world. James lowered his rifle but didn't sheath it. Trust was not something he had left to give freely. The woman studied him with a soldier's precision, reading danger in the angles of his shoulders and the way he held his weapon. When she finally spoke, her English was rough, but her meaning cut straight through the dry air. "You need a woman like me." James blinked, startled by her bluntness. No plea, no visible fear, just an offer spoken with weary certainty. "Ma'am?" he managed. She continued evenly. "I work, I cook, fix things, care for animals. We need shelter." James looked from her to the silent boy and felt something shift in him, the first stirrings of purpose since Margaret died. He should have sent them toward Redstone Town where the law might sort things out. Instead, something in her pride, her unbroken posture even in exhaustion, echoed the woman he had lost. "Get on the horse," James said. "Both of you." The woman hesitated, but after a glance at the boy, she climbed up. James led Flint on foot, guiding them toward Ironwood Ranch and the story Henry had finally asked to hear. The walk back to Ironwood Ranch took nearly 2 hours, and every step revealed something new about the woman James had brought into his quiet, grief-stilled world. She moved like someone used to long journeys, measured, steady, conserving strength without ever showing weakness. But James noticed the slight hitch in her stride, the way her left side favored itself. There was an injury hidden under the buckskin, one she tried to ignore. The boy, meanwhile, clutched that leather pouch to his chest with white-knuckled determination, never speaking, never looking anywhere but ahead. Silence surrounded him like a shield, and James recognized the weight of it. Some silences were mere quiet. Others were scars you carried whether you wanted to or not. By the time the ranch came into view, its worn cabin, leaning chicken coop, weather-beaten barn, and overgrown garden, the sun had begun its slow descent, painting the world in long shadows that stretched across the dry earth like reaching fingers. Inside the cabin, the woman studied the cramped space with that same tactical focus she'd given the ravine. She took in the windows, the single door, the fireplace, the table, and mismatched chairs, the narrow bed. She scanned everything with the eyes of someone who had slept in dangerous places and learned that safety was always temporary. James gestured for her to sit, but she remained near the doorway with the boy, both watching him cautiously. His shoulder throbbed with that old mountain lion wound, angry now, swollen from days of neglect. He tried to hide it. She noticed anyway. With no request for permission, she opened the boy's pouch and revealed bundles of herbs, roots, and small stones wrapped in cloth. The smell rising from them was sharp and earthy, a scent that belonged to medicine far older than the townsfolk's apothecary bottles. "Sit," she said simply. James obeyed more quickly than he expected, driven partly by pain, partly by something else, trust, or the beginning of it. She crushed herbs between her palms and mixed them with water in a wooden bowl, creating a paste so dark it seemed almost black. "Hurts," she warned, lifting his sleeve. When she pressed the mixture onto his wound, fire shot through his arm, searing down to bone. James clenched his teeth but didn't pull away. Her hands were steady, sure, trained by necessity and loss. The boy leaned forward, watching with wide, solemn eyes. He whispered something, his first sound since James had met him, barely audible. "He's strong." The woman replied gently, "Strong is foolish if pain ignored." There was the faintest curve of humor or reproach in her tone, something almost humanizing in the midst of suffering. James felt an ache twist through him, not from the wound but from memory. Margaret had spoken to him that same way, chiding him softly when he pushed himself past reason. The woman tied the bandage with strips torn from her own dress, knots neat and practiced. When she stepped back, the pain had dulled into something manageable, something healing. When the stew began simmering, the cabin filled with smells James hadn't realized he missed. Herbs, meat, and something subtly warm that belonged more to home than survival. While Aayita worked at the stove, the boy knelt on the wooden floor and began drawing with a small piece of charcoal. His movements were urgent, driven by something deep inside him. James approached to look, expecting childish shapes. Instead, he found raw truth sketched in rough lines, a man on the ground, blood pooling around him, others standing over the body, one taller, holding something unmistakably like a weapon. The boy drew with the intensity of someone trying to trap memory before it slipped away. When his mother saw the drawing, her entire face hardened, grief carved into stone. "My husband," she said quietly. "Thomas White Feather. This is how he died." James waited, offering silence instead of pressure. Aayita inhaled slowly, gathering the strength to speak. "Thomas found silver at Black Mesa. Not much, just enough to dream of a future. But Vincent Dutch wanted it. Dutch said Thomas owed him for his son's death." Her voice grew sharper, the rhythm of pain and memory blurring together. "Last winter, Dutch's boy Jacob got lost in storm. Thomas found him, brought him home, gave medicine, prayed for him. But disease too deep. When Jacob died, Dutch blamed Thomas, said Apache ways killed him." She paused, eyes burning with old anguish. "When Thomas discovered silver, Dutch came with 3 men. They demanded he give it up. Thomas refused. He fought. They shot him, made it look like rocks fell." Her hand tightened on her son's shoulder. Takakota saw it all. He hid behind boulders. He watched his father die. James felt cold settle in his gut. A child forced into silence by horror. A widow running for her life. A story of greed wrapped in grief twisted out of shape. Aayita continued, "Next day, Dutch came to our home. Said I must give him map. Said he would take Takakota. White men raise him, make him forget his father. I burned map in front of Dutch. Then we ran." She looked at James, expression raw. "You should not help us. Danger follows." James rose slowly, shoulders heavy with the weight of understanding. "You're under my roof," he said. "And that means something." His voice held no bravado, just quiet conviction. The boy approached, hesitating only a moment before taking James's calloused hand. Then he took his mother's. 3 hands linked, fragile, uncertain, but bound by something forming in the spaces between them. "Family," Takakota whispered, voice trembling like a new seedling in spring wind. "We stay together." James swallowed hard. The boy's words felt like a promise and a plea both. "Then we'll prepare," he said. "Dutch won't stop. That means neither can we." They planned through the night, digging a covert tunnel from the root cellar to the creek bed, reinforcing the cabin, gathering supplies. They spoke little, but trust settled gradually between them, the kind that takes root not in comfort, but in shared survival. James taught Takakota how to shoot, how to breathe steady, how to hold a rifle without letting fear shake his aim. The boy learned fast, driven by purpose sharper than childhood should ever carry. In return, Aayita taught James to read the land as if it were a living map. She showed him which plants healed and which poisoned, how to read tracks not just for species but for intent, running, wandering, hunting. She pointed out wind patterns, animal trails, places where water hid beneath dry earth. Their worlds merged in those quiet lessons, stitched together by necessity and a growing respect neither dared name yet. But the threat never left them. On the 3rd day, while James worked deep in the tunnel, Aayita's voice called down to him, urgent but calm. "Someone is here." James climbed out, dust-covered and aching, to find Sheriff Samuel Ridge waiting in the yard. The lawman's gaze swept from James to the woman with the knife at her belt. "Got a telegram," Ridge said. "Dutch is claiming she's wanted for questioning in her husband's death." James stiffened. Ridge held up a paper bearing the territorial seal. "Dutch bought himself a witness, got signatures, forged or not. I'll lose this warrant on my way back, but a real judge's papers are coming." He lowered his voice. "You've got 2 weeks to find proof, or run." Aayita stepped forward, face taut. "You should let him take me. This fight not yours." James shook his head. "It became mine in that creek bed." Takakota walked up, slipping his hand into James's again. His voice was soft but steady. "We family now." Ridge sighed, the sound of a man who'd seen too much injustice. "Then God help you all." He rode off, leaving dust swirling in his wake, leaving the three of them with the heavy knowledge that time was running short. That night they worked harder, digging, reinforcing, training. The tunnel pushed deeper toward the creek. They built warning traps, stockpiled ammunition, studied the land like a battlefield. Sweat, dirt, bruises and exhaustion became their shared language. As the moon lifted, James sat beside the cabin, staring into the wide, dark valley. He felt Aayita settle beside him, quiet as a shadow. "Why help us?" she asked. He answered without looking away from the horizon. "Because for the first time in 3 years I feel alive again." She said nothing, but the silence between them felt warmer than any words. Dawn on the 12th day arrived with a strange calm, the kind that felt like the land itself was holding its breath. James woke with a start, drenched in sweat, the echo of his own scream tightening his chest. For a brief moment he didn't know where he was, only saw firelight, fever, and Margaret's face fading into the dark of memory. His hand shot under his pillow, gripping the knife he kept hidden there. A shadow hovered near him, and instinct brought the blade up in one swift, shaking motion. But before the knife could strike, the shadow resolved into Aayita's still face. She didn't flinch, didn't raise her hands. She simply stood there, waiting for him to return to himself. Recognition finally broke through the haze. James lowered the knife, staring at it with horror. "I could have killed you," he rasped. "But did not," she answered calmly. "You woke before harm done. That is what matters." She sat on the edge of his bed, not touching him, but offering a presence solid enough to anchor him. He pressed a trembling hand to his eyes, the nightmare already slipping away, but its weight remained lodged deep in his ribs. He told her everything: Margaret's fever, the helplessness, the desperate ride for a doctor who arrived too late. How he'd tormented himself with the belief that if he'd ridden harder or prayed louder, he might have saved both mother and child. For 3 years the guilt had grown, wrapping itself around his heart like barbed wire. Aayita listened as if each word mattered, as if confession itself held the power to mend things long broken. When he finished, she bowed her head. "Dreams show our deepest wounds," she said softly. "Mine show Thomas dying again. I reach for him but cannot move. I scream for help but no sound comes. In dream, I fail him every night." Her voice cracked, the first crack he had heard in her armor. She breathed in shakily. "That is how grief punishes us, not with memory, but with doubt." James stared at her for a long moment. "So what do we do?" he asked. "When grief keeps chasing us down?" She lifted her eyes to his. "We decide it will not kill what is left." Then she stood and took his hand. "Come," she said. "This night you say goodbye proper." They walked together through the dim yard toward the small grave plot where Margaret lay. The moon cast enough silver to guide their steps. James hadn't come here since the funeral, couldn't bear to stand before the silent earth. But now, with Aayita beside him, the weight felt different. Less like drowning, more like wading into cold water you finally had the strength to face. Aayita knelt, gathering sage from the wild growth near the grave. She lit it with flint and steel, the flame catching quickly, the smoke rising in soft spirals. She prayed in her language first, the cadence gentle and powerful, as if speaking to the wind itself. Then she translated, "I ask the spirits to free this man from chains he forged himself. I ask the woman who sleeps here to forgive him for being human. I ask her to send him peace so he may live, and not merely survive. And I ask her to bless what we are building here, for her memory remains in this home." As the smoke drifted skyward, James felt something inside him give way, a pressure, a guilt, a knot that had been tightening for 3 years slowly loosening at last. He didn't collapse, didn't sob, but tears filled his eyes and ran down his face freely. Aayita's tears fell too, for Thomas, for all she had lost. They stood hand in hand, united not by the same grief, but by the simple truth that both had been broken, and yet were still here. When they returned to the cabin, the sky had begun paling with the first promise of dawn. James slept easier that morning, not free of sorrow, but free of the belief that sorrow meant failure. By midday, the tunnel was finally complete. 53 feet of painstaking work, carved from hard earth, braced with timber and lined with hope. They tested it again and again until even Takakota could crawl through it blindfolded. That night they sat at the table planning the next set of defenses, water barrels, firing positions, the order of retreat if things went wrong. Every preparation carried the heavy understanding that Dutch would return long before the law had any chance to undo his deeds. And return he did, on the 13th day, not with wild fury or lawless bravado, but with calculated confidence. He rode down the ranch road wearing the expression of a man who believed destiny itself favored him. Jonah rode on his right, another hired gun on his left. Sheriff Samuel Ridge behind them, grim-faced, trapped by duty. The sight made James's stomach twist. The men halted 100 yards out. Ridge rode forward alone. "James," he called, weary already. "I brought the official papers. Judge came early. Warrants real this time." James felt Aayita tense beside him. She stepped forward and said quietly, "I go with him, but my son stays." James shook his head sharply. "No," she repeated, firmer. "Yes, better one life than three." Before they could argue, Dutch urged his horse forward. He sat tall, though his eyes were wild with the sickness of long-nursed hatred. "You murdered my boy," he snarled at Aayita. "You and that medicine man husband of yours. Now, you'll answer for it." Aayita's stare was unflinching. "Your son was dying when Thomas found him, fever already deep. Thomas gave blessing for his spirit's journey. You heard what you feared, not what was spoken." The words hit Dutch like a blow, his face twisting, but pride armored him too thickly to let anything through. "Enough," he spat. "Sheriff, arrest her." Ridge looked torn apart inside. Maybe we should wait, hear more." But Dutch hissed, "She goes with me." Now. It happened in one breath. Dutch reached for his revolver. His fingers barely grazed the handle before James fired, hitting Dutch's hand clean through. The Remington flew from his grip, clattering into mud. Dutch screamed, staggering. Jonah drew his weapon, firing at Takakota. The bullet missed by inches. Before Jonah could fire again, Aayita hurled her knife across 30 feet of open yard. It embedded in Jonah's shoulder, dropping him off his horse. Then gunfire erupted everywhere. Rain burst from the sky in a sudden sheet, as if the storm had been waiting for violence to begin. Bullets tore into the mud around the cabin. Lightning shattered the sky in blinding flashes. The siege had begun. James and Aayita retreated into the cabin, dragging Takakota behind them. James slammed the door and dropped the heavy bar, breath coming fast. "We hold as long as we can," he told them. The storm raged outside, water pouring through cracks in the roof, smoke from torches seeping down rafters. The roof caught fire despite the rain, slow at first, then growing with alarming speed. They had minutes before the structure failed. "Barn," James said. "On the lightning strike, we run." They crouched by the door, waiting for a bolt bright enough to blind anyone looking their way. Rain hammered the roof, smoke thickened, then lightning split the sky in a white blaze that turned night into daylight. "Now!" James shouted. He flung open the door. They ran through the storm, mud sucking at their boots, bullets snapping through the rain. A shot grazed Takakota's arm. He stumbled, crying out. James scooped him up and barreled forward, lungs burning. They reached the barn and slammed the doors shut behind them. Inside, shadows loomed between beams, but at least the structure was safer. Aayita bandaged her son quickly while James counted their remaining ammunition. They didn't have enough for a prolonged fight. "We won't win by force," he said quietly. Rain drummed on the roof like fists. Aayita looked at him sharply. "What then?" "I talked to him," James said, "alone." She stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. He stepped closer. "If there's any humanity left in Dutch, any father left under all that rage, I need to reach it." She didn't move at first. Then she touched his cheek gently, an unspoken blessing. "Go," she whispered. "Be the man who saved us in the creek." James stepped out into the rain, hands empty, walking toward Dutch's men with nothing but truth and desperation. Dutch waited in the churned mud, holding his ruined hand, glaring with the eyes of a man caught between grief and madness. "Talk," Dutch growled, and James did, speaking of grief, of losing Margaret and a newborn daughter, of helplessness so deep it felt like drowning. He spoke the truth Dutch never understood, that Thomas's death prayer had been a gift, not an insult, that Jacob's illness had been too far gone for any doctor. He told Dutch the one thing the man had never allowed himself to hear. Your son died of sickness, not neglect. Thomas tried to save him. You killed a better man than you ever were because grief made you blind. Slowly, Dutch's expression shifted, not softening but cracking under the pressure of truth. Then pride snapped it shut again. He reached for the pistol at his belt. Before he could fire, a shot rang out. Sheriff Ridge had aimed true, bringing Dutch down, ending the madness. Rain still poured over the ranch yard as Sheriff Ridge strode toward Dutch's fallen form, his badge flashing whenever lightning split the sky. Dutch lay in the mud, clutching his bleeding hand and the new wound Ridge had given him. The man looked smaller now, as if the storm had washed away the layers of arrogance he'd worn like armor. Ridge kept his gun trained on him while deputies disarmed the remaining hired guns. "It's over, Dutch," Ridge said, voice heavy with both anger and pity. "You're under arrest for murder, attempted murder, conspiracy, and whatever else the judge decides to pile on." Dutch didn't respond at first. He stared at his ruined hand as if it belonged to someone else. Then he began to laugh, a hollow, broken sound that scraped like stones in the throat. "My boy," he whispered. "Jacob, I'm so sorry." The storm quieted to a steady drizzle, as though the sky itself had grown tired. Ridge looked back toward the barn. "James," he called, "it's done." The words felt like the first calm breath after hours of drowning. Inside the barn, James sagged against a support beam as Takakota ran to him. The boy wrapped both arms tightly around his waist, pressing his face into James's soaked shirt. "Papa," Takakota murmured, a word formed cautiously but with conviction. "You came back." James closed his eyes, one hand resting on the boy's head. He'd faced bullets, fire, and a man lost to vengeance, but this single word hit deeper than any wound. "Always," he whispered. "Always, son." Aayita stood a few steps away, her eyes shining with relief and something warmer, deeper, something that didn't need naming. James met her gaze. In it he saw gratitude, trust, and the fragile beginnings of a new life built not from grief alone, but from survival shared. When they stepped out of the barn together, the valley was wrapped in the soft hush that follows a storm. Smoke rose from the ruined cabin, the roof half collapsed, but the land felt strangely peaceful, as if violence had exhaled its last breath here. The following days blurred into a rhythm of rebuilding and healing. The townspeople, hearing what had happened, began arriving in small groups, at first unsure, then eager to help. Pastor Elijah Crane organized work crews that brought lumber, nails, and hands, willing to work from sunrise until dusk. Claire Monroe arrived daily with baskets of food, as though feeding James and Aayita might repair the broken cabin beam by beam. Some came out of shame for having ignored Dutch's corruption, others out of respect for what James had done. But all came, and Ironwood Ranch began rising from the ashes. The new cabin was larger, sturdier, built with the intention of housing more than one lonely soul. Aayita contributed designs, Apache patterns that James carved into the ridge beam, symbols of protection and unity. Takakota helped proudly, fetching tools, learning carpentry alongside ranching. His silence had lifted, his voice grew stronger each day, weaving itself back into the world he'd once retreated from. One afternoon, as the main beam was raised with ropes and careful hands, James stood watching with a swell of emotion he hadn't expected. The beam bore patterns Aayita had drawn, interlocking shapes representing earth, sky, and family bound together. When the beam locked into place, the crowd cheered, and James felt something shift in him. The new cabin wasn't just a building, it was a testament to survival, forgiveness, and the strange miracle of second chances. When construction finished weeks later, the celebration that followed wasn't labeled a wedding, though the entire town treated it as one. Pastor Crane stood on the porch, addressing the gathering with solemn joy. "Today," he said, "we witness a covenant built from trials and held together by choice, a family formed not by blood alone, but by courage." James stood beside Aayita, both dressed in clothing that honored their blended lives. She wore traditional buckskin adorned with beadwork. He wore his best shirt with a necklace she had made, turquoise and silver threaded with meaning. Crane turned to James. Do you promise to stand beside this woman, honor her wisdom, protect her and her son, and build a future that respects both past and present?" James's voice didn't waver. "I do, with everything I am." Crane faced Aayita. "And you, Aayita Whitefeather Thornon, do you choose this man as partner? Do you promise to build a home together, to teach and learn, to walk forward joined in strength?" Aayita answered clearly, English crisp and certain. "I do. I promise to share life with him and raise Takakota as our son. Together we make family from what was broken." In place of rings, they exchanged gifts crafted with purpose. James gave her a knife with a handle carved from elk antler, both beautiful and practical, a tool for daily life. Aayita handed him a medicine pouch she had prepared, filled with herbs meant for protection and healing. Takakota stepped between them with a braided rope, 3 strands intertwined, red for James, black for Aayita, white for himself. 3 strands are stronger than one, he said softly. We are that now. As the party stretched into night, music blended, Apache drum beats merging with fiddle tunes, the rhythms weaving together much like the family had. Food passed from hand to hand, laughter mixing with the crackle of the bonfire. James saw Ridge standing near the edge of the gathering, looking older but relieved. He walked over. Ridge nodded. "Dutch goes to trial next month. He's confessed to everything. Jonah and the others are talking too. Dutch wants to write a letter to the boy, says he needs to say he's sorry." Ridge hesitated. "Think Takakota should see it?" James considered it. "It's his choice. If it brings him peace, he'll read it. If not, he'll burn it. But he deserves the right to decide." Ridge nodded, respect softening his features. "You're a better man than most, James." Later that night, James wandered to the cemetery where Margaret rested. Beside her lay a fresh grave, a stone carved for Thomas Whitefeather, given the respect he'd been denied in death. James knelt between them. "Margaret," he murmured, "I hope you don't mind the company." He rested his hand on Margaret's marker. "I found someone, not to replace you, no one ever could, but someone who walks beside me. Someone you would have liked, I think." He looked toward the cabin glowing with soft lantern light. "And there's a boy now, brave as they come. He calls me Papa. Wish you could meet him." He stood slowly. "I'm not leaving your memory behind, just letting it live beside new ones." As he walked back toward the house, he felt no guilt, only a bitter-sweet peace. In the months that followed, Ironwood Ranch grew into what it was meant to be, a place where past and future met without conflict, a home shaped by 3 hearts learning how to beat together, a land where grief didn't vanish but was carried with strength instead of sorrow alone. And through it all, James woke each morning with a purpose he thought he'd never feel again. Aayita prayed to the rising sun. Takakota grew taller, louder, happier. And James, once a man hollowed out by loss, found himself filled again. One evening, as the 3 of them repaired a fence line near the cottonwoods, Takakota looked up and said, "Papa, are we safe now?" James paused, leaning on his post driver. The valley stretched out before them, quiet, golden in the late light. "Safer than we've been," he said. "Danger doesn't disappear forever, but we'll face whatever comes. Together." Aayita touched her son's shoulder. "Strength is not in never fearing," she said gently. "It is in standing even when afraid." James nodded. "Your mother's right. And this land, it's stronger now too. It remembers what we fought for." The boy considered this before smiling. "Then we keep it safe." James ruffled his hair. "That's the plan." The wind carried the scent of sage and dry earth. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes sang, but their voices didn't feel lonely anymore. Not to James, not to the boy, not to Aayita. Ironwood Ranch had become more than soil and timber. It had become a legacy built from survival, courage, and the stubborn choice to believe in life after loss. Years passed with a quiet steadiness that surprised James. Seasons turned like pages in a long, patient book, each one adding lines to the life he was building with Aayita and Takakota. Ironwood Ranch flourished again. Fields he once let go to dust now thrived with crops, Cattle fattened in the upper pastures, and the old orchard began bearing fruit for the first time in a decade. Visitors came often, not out of curiosity, but out of respect. People who had once whispered prejudice now shared meals, asked advice, and brought their children to learn from Takakota, who grew into a strong, calm young man with his mother's wisdom and his stepfather's steady resolve. James watched him with a pride that felt as natural as breathing. The boy he had once carried through rain and gunfire now carried his own future with confidence. He spoke both languages fluently, hunted with skill, and read land like scripture. And he smiled more, something James had once feared he might never witness. One especially warm spring morning, Takakota prepared to leave for the first time alone. He was nearly 18 now, shoulders broad, eyes bright with purpose. "The Mesa Council invited me," he told James, "to learn from elders. Mama says it is time I know all of my people." James adjusted the strap of the boy's saddlebag, nodding slowly. "It's right that you go," he said, though his heart tugged. "Just remember, your roots run in two directions now. Don't let anyone tell you to choose." Takakota placed a hand over James's. "I know. I am both. I am yours and Mama's. That will not change." Aayita stood nearby, pride softening her usually steady gaze. "He walks his father's path," she murmured. "And yours too." They watched him ride off toward the rising sun, the land opening before him in a bright, promising stretch. James felt both the ache of letting go and the joy of knowing the boy was ready. The ranch felt quieter without his laughter, but it was a good quiet, one earned through years of healing. While Takakota traveled between Apache camps and towns, learning traditions and forging identity, James and Aayita continued tending Ironwood. They repaired fences, harvested crops, sheltered travelers, and lived with a peace they had once believed was impossible. But even in peace, memories lived on. Sometimes James woke before dawn and saw Aayita praying at the eastern edge of the property, her palms open to the sky. Sometimes Aayita watched James teaching a neighbor's child to ride, and felt her heart swell with the knowledge that love had found her again. Their griefs hadn't vanished, they had simply woven themselves into a stronger fabric. One late summer evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sky fade from gold to violet, Aayita said quietly, "You saved us that day at the creek." James shook his head. "No, you saved me. You gave me a reason to stand again." She smiled, touching his hand. "Then we saved each other." The wind carried the scent of sage and the distant call of a hawk. It felt like a blessing. Then came the day James least expected, a day marked not by hardship, but by honor. Word reached Ironwood that Takakota had been chosen to join the Apache peace delegation meeting with territorial officials. The council believed his knowledge of both worlds, native and settler, made him the bridge the region desperately needed. A messenger brought the letter, signed by the elders themselves. James read it twice before the meaning settled. "They trust him," he said quietly. "They see in him what I always saw." Aayita stood beside him, head held high. "He carries his father's spirit and yours. He will speak truth." When Takakota returned home, taller and more self-assured than ever, he hugged them fiercely. "I want you there," he told James. "Both of you. They need to see the family that made me." And so the three of them traveled together to the council grounds, a wide clearing near Red Willow River, shaded by towering pines and marked with colorful banners. The gathering was unlike anything James had seen. Leaders from Apache clans sat in a circle, their voices calm, steady, and profound. Territorial officials listened, some uneasy, some respectful, all aware that history was shifting. When Takakota rose to speak, his words carried the weight of two heritages woven into one. "My father taught me the spirit must be strong. My stepfather taught me the land must be tended. My mother taught me to walk with honor. I stand here because all of them made me." He spoke of injustice, of healing, of shared land and shared futures. He spoke of trust, forged in storms, tested by violence, strengthened by love. When he finished, the clearing fell silent before applause swelled like thunder. James bowed his head, overcome. Aayita's hand slipped into his. "He is fully grown now," she whispered. "He knows who he is." James nodded. and who we are. Years turned into decades. James watched as Takakota married, built a family, and forged a role as mediator between communities that once saw only difference. The ranch thrived. Peace, though imperfect, held more firmly with each passing year. And on long, quiet mornings, James walked the land with the same walking stick he'd leaned on the first day Henry asked about his heritage. Only now the stick was carved with designs Takakota and Aayita had added over time, symbols representing unity, courage, and the intertwined paths of three souls. When age finally began to dim his steps, James spent more time on the porch, telling stories to grandchildren who climbed over him like curious fox pups. They knew him not as a man shaped by sorrow, but as a patriarch shaped by perseverance and gentle strength. Near the end, when his hair had gone fully white and the valley glowed with the quiet peace of autumn, James asked to be taken to the cemetery one last time. Aayita, her hair streaked with silver but her posture still regal, helped him walk the familiar path. They stood before Margaret's grave first. James knelt, touching the marker. "Thank you," he whispered, "for loving me then, and for letting me live again after." Then they stood before Thomas Whitefeather's stone. "You'd be proud of your son," James said softly, "and of Aayita, and of the life we built." The wind stirred the sagebrush gently, like an answer. Aayita knelt beside him. "You have given more than you took," she murmured. "You walked a hard road and did not let it change your heart." James smiled faintly. "Only you could say that." She took his hand. "Only because it is true." A few days later, James Thornon passed peacefully in his sleep, the morning sun warming the quilt Aayita had sewn for him. The valley mourned him with the quiet reverence reserved for men who had shaped it with love, not dominance. At his funeral, Takakota stood before the gathered crowd and spoke with a steady voice. "My father was not Apache by blood, but he lived with Apache honor. He was not born to this land, but he protected it. He saved my life, gave me a home, and taught me what it means to be a man in two worlds. I will carry him with me until my last breath." Aayita placed James's medicine pouch over his chest before the casket was lowered, returning to him the gift she had once given to steady his spirit. As the earth covered him, the wind rose gently across the ridge, almost like a voice whispering goodbye. In the years that followed, the ranch continued under Takakota's care, its legacy deepening with every generation. Aayita lived long enough to watch her grandchildren dance under the cottonwoods, their laughter ringing through the same valley where she once ran for her life. Peace wasn't perfect, but it held, because people like James had chosen to fight for it. And every sunset that washed Ironwood Ranch in gold seemed to remember the man who had rebuilt his life from ashes and found love in its truest form, the kind that rises from courage, forgiveness, and the quiet strength of family. Henry grew old hearing the story from his grandfather, and every time he told it, he carried the truth forward, that the past, no matter how heavy, could still pave the way toward grace.